I'm Lindsay, and I'm going to be talking to you today about the American Indian children and families in the child welfare system. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I want to respectfully acknowledge the Wenatchee and Yakima people who have stewarded this land through the generations. I recognize the unique and enduring relationship that exists between Indigenous people and their traditional territories. Let this acknowledgement serve as a reminder of my ongoing efforts to recognize, honor, reconcile, and partner with Indigenous peoples whose lands and water I benefit from today. For generations, Native American families have been victims of social policies that negatively impact children and families. This has shaped the landscape of Native American families and interactions with the child welfare organization historically and today. I start the timeline in the 1800s because that's when the direct impact of child welfare issues begin. But it's important to note that for 200 years before this, the Native Americans had been facing a Western invasion that included massacres, loss of land, outlawing of tribal ceremonies and traditions, forced Western education, broken treaties, and laws that sought to extinguish the Native American population altogether. There's a link at the bottom of this slide if you want to see a more start-to-finish, detailed timeline of Native American history in the U.S. So from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s, assimilation and boarding schools were the primary means of obstructing the impact of Native American culture. Many of the efforts to assimilate the Native American people were aimed at children. Focusing efforts on children made sense to colonizers whose policy was designed to erase one culture and replace it with another, because children are vulnerable to change and less likely to resist it. As one author stated, the main thrust of federal policy since the Indian Wars has been to break up the extended family, the structure, to tribalize and assimilate Indian populations. Boarding schools were also used as a means of destabilizing Indigenous people. Federal boarding schools separated children from families and natural supports and placed them in schools that were off reservation. At the schools, they were punished for displaying their culture in terms of language, observing any sort of traditions, or wearing any native clothing. They also suffered physical and emotional abuse in these boarding houses. According to the Bureau of Indian Affairs, the federal schools were designed to replace native languages with English, replace communal ethics with individualistic ethics, and convert students to Christianity while teaching U.S. history and democracy. By 1838, the federal government oversaw nearly 3,000 students in 87 boarding schools. And in the 1870s, the number of federal boarding schools and number of students they oversaw began to increase dramatically. In the mid-1930s, with the passage of the Indian Reorganization Act and the subsequent closing of the Indian boarding schools, the Bureau of Indian Affairs became concerned that Indian children would be returned to impoverished reservations and families of origin if alternative homes were not found. So the BIA hired social workers to place Indian children in non-Indian homes. And in 1957, it contracted with the Child Welfare League of America to establish the Indian Adoption Project, which eventually led to the adoption of nearly 400 children into non-native homes. The adoption initiative contributed once again to wide-scale separation of Indian families. Throughout the 60s and 70s, social workers were encouraged to persuade unmarried mothers in Native American communities to place their babies up for adoption. Social welfare agencies considered being an unmarried mother as a primary means for removal of a child, even above alcoholism and neglect. It wasn't until 1974 that the government began to address the wrongdoing and implement protective policies for Native American children. After decades of intentionally destructive and some well-intentioned but misplaced policy regarding Native American children and families, testimony was brought before the Senate to shine a light on the detriment of these policies. 4 years later, in 1978, the Indian Child Welfare Act, ICWA, was established with the intent to protect the best interests of Indian children and to promote the stability and security of Indian tribes and families. Research has shown that in the years before ICWA was established, 25 to 35% of all Native children were removed from their families, and 85% of these were placed outside of the family and community, even when suitable and willing relatives were available for placement. The purpose of ICWA is to protect the best interest of Indian children and promote stability and security of Indian tribes, and create state and federal standards for removing children that require placements in homes that reflect the unique values of Indian culture. Unfortunately, the standards were not clearly stated or officially overseen or enforced, and as a result, misinterpretation and noncompliance has hindered the success of ICWA. In 2013, the Bureau of Indian Affairs created a more specific guideline for the ICWA compliance, and later that year, the first federal regulation aimed at clarifying the intent of ICWA through policy changes was established. So between 1978 and 2013, nothing was done to improve the outcomes for ICWA. Unfortunately, the implementation of ICWA in terms of child welfare is often viewed by social workers as a hassle and extra work. I saw this firsthand in my experience with DCYF here in Washington State. ICWA requires a lot of extra documentation and a lot of extra efforts to be made to ensure placement of children in tribal and Native homes, and that requires a lot of work for social workers. Unfortunately, I think social workers lose sight of the bigger picture of why they're doing that work in the first place, and it just becomes another hassle and a thing to tick the box. So that has also led to noncompliance. In an effort to respond to non-culturally informed social workers and the noncompliance of ICWA, the NICWA, the National Indian Child Welfare Association, was established. The NICWA seeks to protect Native children, to promote safe, healthy, and culturally strong families and environments, to promote spiritual strength for Native children and a positive cultural identity, to advocate and facilitate for proper implementation of ICWA, and to provide technical assistance and information among American Indian and Alaska Native child welfare programs. Despite overall decreases in rates of out-of-home placement, Indian children remain disproportionately representative in the foster care system, at more than twice the rate of the general population. So Native families are more than 4 times more likely to have their children removed and placed in foster care than their white counterparts. So the chart you're looking at now shows disproportionality index, which displays the rate of Native American children in foster care as it relates to their population in general. So you can see that the disproportionality is far exceeding any other population in foster care. So, what types of services are available for families in child welfare? The National Indian Child Welfare Association, we already talked about, exists to help preserve culture and create a sense of unity and a higher standard of implementation of the ICWA. The Bureau of Indian Affairs is a government-to-government connection. They offer practical support for families who are involved in child welfare services and work alongside government agencies to implement ICWA. Indian Child Welfare Act programs are grant-funded programs that families can benefit from when they find themselves in child welfare. And then the state child welfare agencies are also required to work alongside tribal families in a different capacity than other families because of ICWA. So before I go on to what this means for social workers and what we can do, I want to talk a little bit about generational trauma. It's important to note the impact of generational trauma in the lives of Native American families. This isn't a situation where culture was just unrepresentative or undervalued. Their culture was disintegrated. Through boarding schools, assimilation, removal of children, Native Americans have watched their culture disappear. There's many traditions that didn't have a line to be passed through to the next generation, and languages that have died before reaching the tongues of their children. These atrocities have fostered a deep lack of trust that has been handed down through generations, and now, even as many systems aim to help and remedy the historical problems, the lack of trust remains. So it's imperative that any work done on behalf of the Native community is done alongside the Native community. The community-based, tribally based, participatory research model offers a framework that allows for this collaboration. CBPR seeks to bridge the gap between academia and community, which is especially relevant when working with Native American tribal communities. So interventions at the micro level involve listening and learning. As social workers, we need to learn about oppression and privilege, about the history of colonization, about Indigenous people and their culture, about the land we live on, and we also need to listen. There's books, blogs, documentaries, online resources, music that Indigenous people have written and performed, and literature. It's important to note when finding resources that we find resources that were created and written by Indigenous people, not about Indigenous people. We also need to act and advocate. We need to be accountable toward the Indigenous people that we work with. We need to be humble and aware, acknowledging that they are the experts, and utilizing the skills of empathy to try to align ourselves with the struggle that they face and speaking up when something isn't right. On the meso level, there are specific programs that we can implement and work toward and advocate for as social workers. The two programs listed here are examples of the type of intervention that come from integrating tribal members in the research and the construction of programs. So the Positive Indian Parenting Program and the Family Spirit Home Visiting Program were created alongside tribal members. Members from over 29 tribes in Washington state were consulted, and the researchers used the community-based, tribally based participatory research model to establish these programs. So the first one is the Positive Indian Parenting, and that draws on the strengths of traditional Indian rearing practices such as storytelling, cradle boards, and other traditional methods of child rearing like wrapping babies, lessons of nature, behavior management, and the use of praise. It addresses the historic impact of boarding schools, intergenerational trauma, and forced assimilation, and how that impacts parenting. It empowers Indian families to reclaim the right to their heritage to parent. And it's strengths-based and a curriculum that can be delivered either in groups or in the home. Family Spirit is a program that envisions a future where every community, regardless of socioeconomic status, will have access to evidence-based, culturally competent early childhood home visiting, and employs local paraprofessionals to increase health and well-being for parents and young children in their communities. This is especially important in tribal communities, that it's someone from within their community who understands their culture that is portraying and presenting these ideas for them. Family Spirit addresses intergenerational behavioral health problems and applies local cultural resources to their work. It is the only evidence-based home visiting program ever designed for and by and with American Indian families, and it's used in over 100 tribal communities across 16 states. So as we listen and learn and we partner with Native communities to implement culturally relative interventions, we'll begin to see the need for and benefits of change at a higher level as well. As social workers, we should advocate for policy and law that furthers the health, safety, preservation, and culture of Native American families. Thank you for your time today. I hope that you learned something that can help you in your practice.